Subscribe now to the Circle of Fear 1 for more chilling stories. Court records from Oklahoma. Territory tell of a woman whose very name made plantation owners fall silent. Sarah Granger, a name whispered with equal parts terror and fascination across 3 counties, stood trial not once, but 4 separate times between 1847 and 1856. Each trial involved the same peculiar charge: grievous assault upon the person of her lawful master. Each time the courtroom emptied of women and children before testimony began, and each time, despite overwhelming evidence, no jury would convict her. The wounds she inflicted were too specific, too calculated, too permanent. 3 men lost their ability to father children. A 4th lost something else entirely, his mind, they say, though the official record lists only severe trauma, requiring medical intervention. The authorities knew what she'd done, the community knew. But something about Sarah Greer's case made even hardened frontier judges look away. What could drive a legal system built on absolute control to repeatedly release its most dangerous captive? Before we continue with the story of Sarah Granger, I need you to do something. Subscribe to Circle of Fear 1, hit that notification bell. Because stories like this, the ones they tried to bury in forgotten court archives, don't surface often. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're watching from. I want to know where these stories are reaching. Now, let's discover what made Sarah Granger so dangerous that even her owners feared putting her name in writing. The question of what made Sarah Granger wasn't one that could be answered by her appearance alone, though those who saw her never forgot she stood just over 5 feet tall with hands that seemed too delicate for the cotton fields where she'd spent most of her 32 years. Her face bore a single, distinctive mark, a thin scar running from her left temple to her jawline, courtesy of an overseer's whip when she was 14, but it was her eyes that unsettled people. They didn't carry the downcast submission expected of someone in her position. They measured. They calculated. They remembered everything. Sarah had been born in 1824 on a tobacco plantation in northern Alabama, the daughter of a woman whose name was never recorded in any ledger. Her first master, Edmund Hartwell, had been what the community considered reasonable. He fed his workers adequately, punished only when drunk, and occasionally allowed marriages among his property. Sarah learned to read by watching Hartwell's daughter practice her letters, memorizing the shapes through a crack in the schoolroom wall. This education, illegal and dangerous, would later prove essential to her survival. When Hartwell died in 1842, his estate was liquidated to pay gambling debts. Sarah was 18, strong and literate, qualities that made her valuable. She was sold to a cotton trader named James Wickham for $850, a price that reflected both her physical capability and what Wickham called her refined bearing. The sale separated her from her mother, her 2 younger brothers, and the only home she'd known. The journey west to Oklahoma Territory took 6 weeks. Chained in a wagon with 11 others watching the landscape change from green hills to endless prairie. Oklahoma Territory in 1842 was a contradictory place, officially Indian territory, yet increasingly populated by white settlers who brought their peculiar institutions with them. The land itself seemed caught between identities. Creek and Cherokee nations coexisted uneasily with Presbyterian missionaries, federal troops, and plantation owners fleeing depleted soil in older states. Towns like Tahlequah and Fort Gibson served as administrative centers where territorial law, tribal sovereignty, and federal jurisdiction collided in unpredictable ways. Wickham's holdings lay 15 mi south of Fort Gibson in what's now Muskogee County, 300 acres of cotton, corn, and tobacco worked by 42 men, women, and children living in a row of 7 cabins behind the main house. The overseer, a thick-necked Georgian named Walter Pewitt, ran the fields with methodical brutality. 20 lashes for talking during work, 30 for leaving the fields without permission, 50 for striking back. The punishment was administered publicly, every Saturday after sundown, the assembled workers forced to watch while Pewitt demonstrated the consequences of disobedience. Sarah spent her first 3 months keeping her head down and her literacy hidden. She picked cotton with mechanical efficiency, never the fastest but never the slowest. She learned which workers could be trusted and which would trade information for extra rations. She learned that Wickham visited the cabins on Tuesday nights when his wife traveled to Fort Gibson to visit her sister. She learned that Puit preferred the younger women, the ones who hadn't yet developed the hollow-eyed resignation that came with years of such attention. She also learned that Wickham's wife, Charlotte, knew everything that happened on the plantation, but had long since stopped caring. Charlotte Wickham had been a Charleston belle once, daughter of a shipping magnate, educated in French and piano. Now she was 34, childless, and sustained by laudanum and the pretense that her husband's nocturnal wanderings were merely inspections of the property. She spent her days in the parlor playing the same Chopin nocturne over and over until the notes seemed to bleed into the walls. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday in late November 1842, 5 months after Sarah's arrival. Wickham appeared at her cabin door just after 10 marred, when most of the exhausted workers had collapsed into sleep. He carried no lamp. He knew the path too well. Was awake. Had been awake because Tuesday nights had a particular quality of silence. The other women in the cabin didn't move when Wickham entered, didn't acknowledge his presence. This was the unspoken rule. You pretended not to see, not to hear, not to know. Wickham stood over Sarah's pallet for a long moment. She could smell the whiskey on him mixed with tobacco and the pomade he used on his hair. When he reached down and touched her shoulder, she didn't flinch. She simply said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I'll kill you if you touch me again." He laughed. The sound was soft, almost fond, as if she'd told a clever joke. His hand moved from her shoulder to her throat, not squeezing, just resting there, a reminder of the power differential, the absolute nature of his ownership. What happened next took perhaps 3 seconds, though witnesses later struggled to describe the sequence of events. Sarah's hand, which had been hidden beneath her thin blanket, emerged holding something metallic. There was a brief violent motion. Wickham made a sound, not quite a scream, more like all the air leaving his lungs at once, and staggered backward, colliding with the cabin wall. Blood soaked through his trousers with shocking speed. Sarah stood and walked past him out into the November night, still holding the cotton knife she'd stolen from the gin house 2 weeks earlier. She walked directly to the main house, climbed the steps to the porch, and knocked on the door with the calm precision of someone delivering an expected message. Charlotte Wickham answered, still dressed despite the late hour, her eyes glazed with opium and something that might have been curiosity. Sarah held out the bloodied knife, handle first, and spoke clearly. "Your husband tried to force himself on me. I've injured him. He's in cabin 4. He'll need a doctor." Then she sat down on the porch steps and waited for whatever came next. What came next was Dr. Theodore Gaines, roused from sleep at midnight and riding 14 miles through darkness to attend to an injury whose nature refused to describe in detail. Gaines arrived to find Wickham barely conscious, his wife sitting in the parlor still playing that same nocturne, and Sarah Granger sitting on the porch with her hands folded in her lap as if attending church service. The medical details entered the official record only as severe trauma to the gentleman's person, rendering future marital relations inadvisable, in less delicate terms shared in whispers between doctors and lawyers over the following weeks. Sarah had castrated James Wickham with a 3-in cotton knife, the cut so clean and precise that Gaines initially thought she must have had surgical training. The blade had removed both testicles with what he described in his private journal as remarkable anatomical knowledge. Wickham survived physically. He spent 6 weeks recovering in his bedroom while Charlotte continued her piano practice downstairs, the mechanical repetition of those same 16 measures serving as the household's only acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. Puit ran the plantation in Wickham's absence, his punishments growing more severe, his temper shorter. But he didn't touch Sarah. Nobody touched Sarah. The legal question of what to do with her became Oklahoma Territory's most uncomfortable conversation. Territorial law was clear. A slave who struck a master could be executed. A slave who caused permanent injury to a master should be executed. But the circumstances, Wickham's nocturnal visit, the location of the injury, the fact that Sarah had immediately surrendered herself, created complications no one wanted to address publicly. The territorial judge, Samuel Breenage, was a Kentucky transplant who'd spent 20 years navigating the Impossible contradictions of frontier justice. He'd presided over land disputes between Cherokee Nation and white settlers, treaty violations, murder cases where tribal and federal law offered opposing verdicts. But Sarah Greer's case presented something different, a moral question disguised as a legal one. Greenidge interviewed Sarah privately in the Fort Gibson courthouse, a conversation never officially transcribed, but later recounted to his clear. She answered his questions with disturbing calm. Yes, she'd taken the knife 2 weeks prior, anticipating Wickham's eventual visit. Yes, she knew the anatomy well enough to ensure the injury would be permanent. No, she felt no remorse. When Greenidge asked why she'd chosen such a specific punishment, her answer chilled him. I wanted to make sure he couldn't do to anyone else what he tried to do to me. The trial lasted 1 day. Wickham couldn't attend, his physician claimed. Though, the truth was simpler. He couldn't face a courtroom where the details of his injury would become public record. P. testified that Sarah had always been difficult, prone to insolent behavior. Dr. Gaines testified to the nature and severity of the injury. Charlotte Wickham didn't testify at all, though. She sat in the gallery throughout, her expression unreadable. The defense, such as it was, came from an unexpected source. A Creek tribal delegate named William Harjo stood and argued that under tribal law, which technically still applied to crimes committed in Indian Territory, Sarah's actions constituted self-defense against sexual assault. His presence was irregular, possibly illegal, and definitely unprecedented. But Greenidge allowed him to speak. The jury of 12 white men deliberated for 7 hours. They returned a verdict of not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Territorial prosecutors demanded a retrial. Plantation owners from 3 counties sent letters of outrage. Baptist minister published a sermon in the Fort Gibson newspaper warning that acquitting Sarah would encourage rebellion and chaos among the servile population. But Greenidge stood by the verdict, and Sarah returned to Wickham's plantation, where she was immediately sold. Her new owner was Marcus Sheffield, a widower who operated a smaller farm 30 miles west. The sale price was $250 less than Wickham had paid, reflecting what Sheffield called her diminished value due to criminal tendencies. Sheffield had a reputation as a reasonable master, a man who attended Presbyterian services every Sunday and occasionally allowed his workers to earn small wages for extra tasks. Sarah had been on Sheffield's property for 4 months when she cut him too. The pattern, once established, became impossible to ignore, though many tried desperately to ignore it. Anyway, Sheffield's injury occurred under circumstances almost identical to Wickham's. A late-night visit to the cabins, an attempted assault, Sarah's swift and anatomically precise response. This time, she used a straight razor she'd stolen from Sheffield's own shaving kit, discovered hidden beneath his bed during her rotation cleaning the main house. Sheffield, unlike Wickham, survived his injuries with somewhat better health. Dr. Gaines, called once again to attend to an undisclosed trauma, noted in his journal that the damage was severe but not entirely catastrophic. Sheffield retained some function, though he would never father the children he'd been discussing with potential second wives just weeks before the incident. The second trial drew a larger crowd. People traveled from as far as Tahlequah to watch. Sensing that Sarah Greer's case had become something more than a legal proceeding, it was a referendum on questions the territory didn't want to ask itself. How much violence was justified in self-defense? Could property defend itself against its owner? What happened when the law's absolute positions encountered situations that defied absolute answers? This time Sarah testified. Greenidge allowed over the prosecutor's furious objections, and for 2 hours she described her life with a clarity that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. She spoke of being sold away from her mother at 18. She described Wickham's pattern of Tuesday night visits the way the other women in the cabin had learned to become invisible to pretend sleep, so complete they might as well have been dead. She explained with unsettling calm that after Wickham she'd assumed incorrectly it turned out that her reputation would protect her from future assaults. I thought, she said, looking directly at the jury, that once a man knew what I was capable of, he would choose differently. I was wrong about that. Mr. Sheffield knew exactly what happened to Mr. Wickham. He bought me, anyway. The prosecutor, a red-faced man named Harrison Tate, demanded to know if she felt any remorse. Sarah's answer would be quoted in newspapers as far east as Richmond. I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret defending myself. The second jury deliberated for 11 hours. They returned the same verdict. Not guilty, Sheffield. Sold her immediately, this time for $420. The declining price reflecting what everyone in Oklahoma Territory now knew. Buying Sarah Granger meant accepting certain risks. Her next owner, Elias Drummond, apparently believed himself immune to those risks. He operated a cotton gin and small mill near the Canadian River, employed 3 other workers, and considered himself a progressive master because he allowed his people to marry and maintain small garden plots. Drummond lasted 9 months before Sarah cut him. Same pattern, same outcome. A late-night visit and attempted assault, a precise injury that ended his reproductive capability. This time, she used a paring knife from the kitchen, its edge honed to surgical sharpness on the millstone. Dr. Gaines, summoned for the 3rd time to treat injuries he found increasingly disturbing, began keeping detailed notes about the consistency of Sarah's technique. In his private journal, he wrote, "She possesses knowledge of human anatomy that would be impressive in a medical student. How she acquired this knowledge I cannot fathom." The 3rd trial drew national attention. Abolitionist newspapers in Boston published editorials praising Sarah's resistance. Pro-slavery publications called for her immediate execution, arguing that 3 separate assaults proved premeditation and malice. A delegation of plantation owners petitioned the territorial governor to intervene, claiming that Sarah's continued freedom endangered the very fabric of civilized society. But the pattern held. Despite overwhelming evidence, despite Drummond's testimony, despite the prosecutor bringing 3 separate doctors to describe the injuries in clinical detail, the jury acquitted her. This time the deliberation took 15 hours, and 2 jurors later admitted to a newspaper that they believed Sarah was guilty under the law but couldn't bring themselves to convict her. Drummond didn't sell Sarah, he freed her. The manumission papers filed in December 1851 cited irreconcilable differences in temperament and included a clause forbidding Sarah from returning to Muskogee County. He paid her $75 a year's wages for skilled labor and arranged transportation to Fort Smith, Arkansas, where a small free black community had established itself along the river. Sarah lived in Fort Smith for 3 years. She worked as a seamstress, earning enough to rent a small room above a dry goods store. She learned to read and write with greater fluency, attending evening classes taught by a Quaker school teacher who asked no questions about her past. She might have remained there, building a quiet life far from the events that made her name whispered with fear across Oklahoma Territory. But in May 1854 she returned. She walked back across the border into Indian Territory, traveled the 43 miles to Fort Gibson, and presented herself at the courthouse. She wanted to testify at a trial not her own, but that of another woman, accused of assaulting her master under similar circumstances. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Sarah Granger's story intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The woman Sarah wanted to defend was named Hannah, no surname recorded, 19 years old, accused of striking her master with a fire poker after he forced entry to her cabin. Hannah's master had survived with a broken collarbone and severe bruising. Unlike Sarah's cases, which involved clear patterns of attempted assault, Hannah's defense was less certain. The master claimed he'd been checking on reports of illness, that Hannah had attacked without provocation. Sarah's appearance in the courtroom caused immediate controversy. Judge Breenage, now 63 and increasingly weary of Oklahoma Territory's impossible contradictions, initially refused to allow her testimony. She wasn't a witness to the events in question. She had no legal standing in the case, but Sarah had anticipated these objections. She brought documents, 4 years of correspondence with other women across 3 territories, letters describing similar incidents, patterns of assault, and retaliation, the legal outcomes that followed. She'd been collecting these accounts since her arrival in Fort Smith, using her literacy and her wages to maintain a network of information that few people knew existed. Some letters came from free women. Many came from those still enslaved, smuggled out. Through networks Sarah had cultivated with quiet persistence. Greenidge reviewed the correspondence in his chambers. What he read disturbed him deeply enough that he made an unprecedented decision. He would allow Sarah to testify not as a fact witness but as what he called an expert in matters of self-defense against sexual assault. The prosecution objected violently. The territorial attorney general threatened to file a complaint against Greenidge with the federal judiciary. The judge didn't care anymore. He was dying. Everyone knew it. Though the official diagnosis wouldn't come for another year, and he'd spent 2 decades watching the legal system bend itself into impossible shapes to avoid asking the questions that mattered most. Sarah testified for 3 days. She described the pattern she documented. The time of night assaults typically occurred, the excuses masters gave for visiting the cabins, the way communities of enslaved people developed warning systems and protective strategies. She explained the anatomy of self-defense, why certain injuries were more effective deterrents than others, how precision mattered when physical strength was unequal. The prosecutor, the same Harrison Tate who'd failed to convict Sarah 3 times, tried repeatedly to get her to admit premeditation, to acknowledge that she'd planned these attacks in advance. Each time Sarah gave the same answer: I prepared for the possibility of needing to defend myself. That's not the same as planning to attack someone. Hannah was acquitted. The verdict came after 19 hours of deliberation. The jury deadlocked multiple times before finally agreeing. The foreman later told a newspaper that Sarah's testimony had been the deciding factor, not because it proved Hannah's innocence, but because it made them understand things we'd preferred not to think about. Sarah's return to Oklahoma territory triggered something unexpected. Other women began seeking her out. They came at night in secret, sometimes traveling 20 or 30 miles to speak with her. They brought questions about protecting themselves, about the legal consequences of resistance, about whether Greenidge's courtroom represented a real change or merely a temporary aberration. Sarah answered their questions with the same calm precision she brought to everything. She taught them anatomy not from books, which she couldn't safely carry, but from memory and diagrams she drew in dirt or ash. She explained which injuries were most effective, which left the least room for retaliation, which could be defended in court as proportionate response to assault. She never encouraged violence. She simply provided information, then let each woman decide for herself what to do with that knowledge. The plantation owners noticed. Of course they noticed. Between 1854 and 1856, 9 separate incidents occurred across Oklahoma and Arkansas territories. Cases where enslaved women injured masters or overseers who'd attempted assault. Not all the injuries were as severe as Sarah's signature technique, but the pattern was unmistakable, precise, calculated, aimed at specific anatomical targets designed to end reproductive capability. A group of 23 plantation owners formed what they called the Territorial Property Protection Committee. They hired a lawyer from Richmond, Virginia, a specialist in what was euphemistically termed servi insurrection law. His name was Cornelius Vance, and he'd successfully prosecuted dozens of cases involving slave rebellions and resistance. He came to Oklahoma territory with one goal: to find a legal mechanism to charge Sarah Granger with something that would stick. Vance couldn't charge her with the original assaults. She'd been acquitted, and double jeopardy protected her. He couldn't charge her with teaching, reading, and writing because she was a free woman now beyond those restrictions. But he found something else: conspiracy to commit mayhem. It was an obscure statute rarely used, based on English common law from the 1600s. The charge didn't require proof that Sarah had directly participated in any attack, only that she'd provided knowledge and encouragement that led to injuries. The 4th trial began in August 1856. This time the prosecution called 17 witnesses: masters who'd been injured, overseers who testified to seeing Sarah meeting with women who later committed assaults, Even one woman who claimed Sarah had explicitly instructed her on where to cut. The courtroom was packed. Federal marshals stood guard, anticipating violence. Judge Breenage, visibly frail, now his hands shaking as he held his gavel, presided over what everyone knew would be his final significant case. Sarah's defense team, 3 lawyers from the newly formed Oklahoma Territorial Bar Association, who'd volunteered their services, argued that teaching self-defense couldn't constitute conspiracy. They brought medical experts who testified that the injuries, while severe, were rarely life-threatening. They presented evidence that every woman who'd been charged following these incidents had been acquitted on grounds of self-defense. But Vance was skilled. He reframed the question brilliantly. Wasn't there a difference between spontaneous self-defense and calculated premeditated action? Didn't Sarah's lessons constitute planning? Didn't the consistency of the injuries across multiple incidents suggest coordination rather than individual desperate acts? The testimony revealed something that horrified the prosecution even as they presented it. Sarah hadn't just been teaching anatomy. She'd been documenting everything. In a rented room above a boarding house in Fort Gibson, investigators found 47 letters, 6 journals, and detailed records of assaults, legal proceedings, and outcomes across 5 territories. Sarah had been building a comprehensive archive of resistance, a record of what worked legally and what didn't, which judges were sympathetic, and which prosecutors could be outmaneuvered. It was in essence a handbook for resistance, not a call for rebellion or violence, but a careful, methodical guide to self-defense and the legal strategies that might protect those who defended themselves. Some pages contained medical drawings, others held transcripts of legal arguments that had succeeded in court. One journal documented the names and outcomes of 43 women who'd been charged with assaulting their masters. 37 had been acquitted, 4 convicted of lesser charges, 2 executed. Vance held up these documents during his closing argument. This, he said, is not spontaneous self-defense. This is organized resistance. This is a deliberate campaign to undermine the fundamental structure of our society. Sarah's lead attorney, a young man named Robert Chenoweth, who'd moved to Oklahoma Territory specifically to challenge slavery through legal channels, stood for his closing statement. He spoke for 2 hours, his words later preserved in court transcripts, that abolitionists would reprint and distribute for decades. Gentlemen of the jury, he said, you've heard the prosecution describe a conspiracy. I ask you to consider what kind of conspiracy requires no secrecy, no hidden meetings, no coded messages, because it consists entirely of teaching women how to protect themselves from assault. Mr. Vance calls this organized resistance. I call it the natural consequence of a system that provides no other protection. Sarah Granger didn't create the need for this knowledge. That need existed long before she began documenting it. She simply gave women the information they needed to survive. The jury deliberated for 4 days. During that time, Fort Gibson existed in a state of suspended tension. Federal troops patrolled the streets, anticipating riots. Plantation owners from across the territory congregated in hotels comparing notes on workers who'd become difficult since Sarah's return. Meanwhile, a group of free black residents and sympathetic whites organized a continuous presence outside the courthouse, waiting silently for the verdict. Judge Breenage used those 4 days to write his own final statement, not a legal document but a personal letter to his daughter in Philadelphia. The letter survived in family archives and was eventually published in 1889. In it, he wrote, I have presided over hundreds of cases in my 20 years on this bench. I have sentenced men to hang, dissolved marriages, adjudicated property disputes worth thousands of dollars, but none of those cases required me to confront the central question that Sarah Graner's trials have forced upon this territory. Can a legal system built on absolute property rights acknowledge that some forms of property have the right to defend themselves? We have constructed an edifice of law that depends on certain people being things rather than humans, and then we act shocked when those people remind us they are in fact human. Sarah Granger is guilty of only one crime: refusing to accept the premise that her body belongs to anyone but herself. The letter was never sent. Greenidge died of heart failure on the third day of jury deliberation, collapsing in his chambers while reviewing case law. His death shocked the territory. He'd been ill for months, but his presence had seemed permanent, as fixed as the courthouse itself. The trial was suspended for 3 days of mourning, then resumed under Judge William Patterson, a younger man with significantly less patience for legal complexity. When the jury finally returned, their foreman looked exhausted. He read the verdict in a voice barely audible beyond the first row, not guilty on all charges. But he didn't stop there. In an unprecedented addition to the standard verdict, he read a statement the jury had collectively written. We find the defendant not guilty of conspiracy because we cannot in good conscience criminalize the act of teaching women to protect themselves from assault. However, we acknowledge the concerns raised by the prosecution regarding the organization and documentation of this knowledge. We therefore recommend that territorial authorities establish clear legal protections for enslaved persons against sexual assault by their masters, rendering such self-defense instruction unnecessary. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. The jury statement was legally meaningless. Juries decided facts, not policy, but its implications were explosive. They'd essentially declared that the problem wasn't Sarah's actions, but the system that made her actions necessary. Vance immediately filed an appeal with territorial authorities, arguing that the jury had exceeded its mandate. The Territorial Property Protection Committee announced a reward of $500 for information leading to Sarah's conviction on any charge. Several newspapers published editorials calling for her exile or arrest on vagrancy charges, but something had shifted. The consensus that had previously existed among Oklahoma Territory's white population that the system itself was beyond question had fractured. Presbyterian ministers began preaching sermons about moral complexity in an immoral institution. The territorial legislature received petitions from women's groups in Fort Smith and Tahlequah asking for exactly what the jury had recommended: legal protections against assault. Nothing came of these petitions. The territorial government, dominated by plantation interests, had no intention of undermining the property rights that formed the foundation of its economy. But the conversation had changed. Sarah Greer's case had forced questions into the open that could no longer be completely suppressed. Sarah herself seemed oddly detached from the controversy swirling around her. She continued living in Fort Gibson, working as a seamstress, maintaining her correspondence with women across multiple territories. She attended church services at the African Methodist Episcopal congregation, sang in the choir, lived a life that seemed almost aggressively normal considering the chaos her trials had created. But she was also preparing. In the 18 months following her fourth acquit, she began transferring her documents to a network of safe locations: churches, private homes, even a Creek Nation council house where a sympathetic delegate agreed to store a trunk of letters and tribal archives. She was creating redundancy, ensuring that even if one location was raided, the information would survive. She also began training others to continue the work. 3 women, 2 formerly enslaved, 1 freeborn, studied with her for months, learning not just the anatomy and legal strategies, but the careful documentation methods that made her archive valuable. They learned to write clearly and concisely, to preserve dates and details, to distinguish between rumor and verified fact. In December 1857, 2 federal marshals arrested Sarah on charges of mail fraud. The charge was technical, absurd on its face. They claimed she'd been using the postal system to distribute information that endangered public safety. The evidence was thin. Few confiscated letters, testimony from a postmaster who admitted he'd been pressured to monitor her correspondence. Everyone understood this was simply the latest attempt to silence her through legal mechanisms. This trial was different from the previous 4. Judge Patterson made clear from the opening that he would tolerate no lengthy testimonies about self-defense or systemic abuse. The question, he insisted, was simple. Had Sarah Granger violated federal postal regulations? Everything else was irrelevant. The trial lasted 2 days. The jury returned a guilty verdict in 40 minutes. Patterson sentenced her to 18 months in federal detention at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to be followed by permanent exile from Oklahoma Territory. As marshals led her from the courtroom, Sarah turned and spoke directly to the gallery, her voice clear, enough to carry to the back rows. They can exile one woman. They cannot exile the knowledge I've shared. Remember that Fort Leavenworth in 1858 was a military installation that doubled as a federal prison for the territories. Sarah arrived in January, shackled in a wagon with 3 other prisoners, and was assigned to the women's section, a limestone building that housed 17 women, convicted of crimes ranging from theft to murder. The building itself told a story of institutional priorities. Built in 1847, the women's section occupied what had originally been a storage facility, 3 long rooms with small windows set high in the walls, designed more for ventilation than light. The limestone walls wept moisture in winter, creating a perpetual dampness that penetrated clothing, blankets, everything. In summer, the same walls held heat like an oven, making the cramped quarters almost unbearable. Each room housed 6 women, sleeping on narrow wooden platforms, with thin straw mattresses that harbored bed bugs and lice. The conditions were harsh, but not intentionally cruel. Or rather, the cruelty was systemic rather than personal. The guards, a rotation of 3 men overseen by a matron named Mrs. Hale, treated the inmates with detached efficiency. They weren't brutal, they simply enforced the rules with mechanical consistency. Silence during work hours, single-file movement between buildings, no physical contact between inmates, mandatory attendance at all meals and religious services. Regardless of health or circumstance, inmates worked in the laundry during the day, washing uniforms for the garrison. Hundreds of pounds of wool and cotton scrubbed by hand in scalding water, wrung out and hung to dry in all weather. The work destroyed hands and backs with democratic impartiality. Women who'd never done manual labor before worked alongside those who'd spent their lives in fields or factories. By the end of the first month, everyone's hands looked the same, cracked, bleeding, perpetually raw from the harsh soap and hot water. They were allowed to write letters, though all correspondence was read by guards before being sent. They attended mandatory church services on Sunday, led by a Methodist chaplain named Reverend Thomas Blackwell, who favored long sermons about repentance and redemption. His favorite theme was the concept of divine justice, how earthly punishments prepared the soul for heavenly salvation. He never looked directly at the inmates when he preached, instead fixing his gaze on a point slightly above their heads as if addressing not the women themselves, but the sins they represented. Sarah adapted with the same calm precision she'd brought to everything else in her life. She worked efficiently at the laundry tubs, her movements economical and practiced. She caused no trouble, responded to orders promptly, kept her thoughts to herself. The other inmates knew her reputation. Several had read about her trials in newspapers, and word traveled quickly in the confined quarters. But Sarah neither confirmed nor denied the stories. When asked directly by a woman named Catherine, a counterfeiter from St. Louis, Sarah simply said, "What I did for reasons that made sense at the time. What you've heard is probably close enough to the truth." The women's section developed its own social hierarchy, as all confined populations do. There were the politicals, women, like Sarah, convicted of crimes that had ideological dimensions. There were the unfortunates, women convicted of theft or prostitution, crimes of poverty, rather than intent. And there were the dangers, 3 women convicted of murder, who occupied a psychological space separate from the rest. The politicals and unfortunates mixed somewhat freely. The dangers were avoided when possible, their presence acknowledged only when absolutely necessary. Sarah found herself occupying an unusual position in this hierarchy. Her crimes were violent, which should have placed her among the dangers. But the specificity of her violence, the fact that it had been defensive rather than predatory, gave her a kind of respected distance. Women sought her out for advice, not about violence, but about navigation, how to endure, how to maintain dignity, in circumstances designed to strip it away, how to hold on to yourself when the institution wanted you to disappear into your crime. She advised them with the same clarity she'd brought to everything else. To the young women terrified of the years ahead, count days if it helps, or don't count them at all. Find a rhythm that makes time bearable rather than torturous. To the older women exhausted by repeated incarcerations, you know this system better than the guards do. Use that knowledge. Be invisible when it serves you. visible when it protects you. To everyone, write. Letters document everything. The only power we have is the power to be remembered accurately. What the authorities didn't know was that Sarah had anticipated this outcome. Before her final trial, she'd finished transferring all her documents to secure locations and had trained her 3 successors thoroughly enough that they could continue the work without her guidance. The archive she'd built wasn't dependent on her physical presence. It existed now in distributed form across 3 territories and churches and private homes and tribal archives, copied and recopied by women who understood its value. One of her successors, Elizabeth, had managed to send a letter that reached Sarah in March, smuggled in through a network that involved a sympathetic and a guard's wife who had abolitionist sympathies. The letter was brief, written in careful code that wouldn't raise suspicion if intercepted. The garden you planted continues to grow. We've harvested seeds and replanted them in new locations. The varieties you cultivated are flourishing in conditions you prepared them for. We tend them carefully and think of you with gratitude. Sarah read the letter 3 times, then burned it in the laundry's coal stove, watching the paper blacken and curl. The information was enough. Her work continued. That knowledge provided a kind of peace she hadn't expected to find within Fort Leavenworth's limestone walls. But imprisonment had provided something Sarah hadn't fully anticipated. Time to think, to reflect, to consider whether the path she'd chosen had been worth the cost. In letters to her friends in Fort Gibson, letters the guards read but couldn't quite figure out how to censor since they contained nothing explicitly illegal, she began to articulate a more complex understanding of her own actions. I did what I believed necessary, she wrote to one friend in March 1858. I would do it, again given the same circumstances. But I wonder sometimes if I've become so focused on the immediate act of resistance that I've failed to imagine what might come after. Defending ourselves from assault is essential, but what comes next? How do we move from resistance to freedom? How do we build lives that don't require us to become dangerous in order to survive? In another letter written in April, the women here have taught me something unexpected. Many of them committed their crimes out of desperation rather than principle. A woman stole bread because her children were starving. Another killed a man who'd beaten her for years. Their stories remind me that resistance takes many forms, not all of them calculated or strategic. Sometimes survival itself is resistance, sometimes just continuing to exist, refusing to be erased, is the most radical act possible. These letters circulated among her network, copied and discussed in quiet conversations. They revealed a Sarah Granger more thoughtful and conflicted than the figure who'd emerged in court transcripts and newspaper accounts, not a simple heroine or villain, but a woman grappling with the consequences of her choices, trying to articulate a philosophy of resistance that went beyond her own specific circumstances. The prison routine had a numbing quality that some inmates found comforting and others found maddening. Wake at 5:30, breakfast of cornmeal mush and Cory, coffee, work from 7 until noon, lunch of bread and bean soup, work from 1 until Sriki dinner of more bread, occasionally with salt pork, lights out at 8. Sunday varied only in the addition of 2 church services, morning and evening, that bracketed a day of enforced rest that felt more like extended confinement. Sarah marked time by the changes in light through the high windows, the way the angle of sun shifted across the laundry room floor as seasons progressed. Spring brought longer days and the smell of prairie grass through the small ventilation openings. Summer brought oppressive heat and the distant sound of military drills. Fall brought cooler air and the formation of geese overhead, their calls somehow reaching even into the stone building. Winter brought darkness and cold that penetrated everything. In July 1858, 6 months into her sentence, something unexpected happened. A group of women petitioned the territorial governor for Sarah's early release, arguing that she'd been convicted on technical charges that wouldn't have stood if the real goal hadn't been to silence her. The petition contained 127 signatures. White women, black women, Creek and Cherokee women, crossing racial and legal boundaries that rarely overlapped. The petition itself was a remarkable document, carefully worded to avoid inflammatory language while making its point clearly. It acknowledged that Sarah had been convicted of mail fraud, then systematically demonstrated why that conviction represented a miscarriage of justice. It noted that the postal regulations she'd allegedly violated were inconsistently enforced. The dozens of people regularly used the mail system for similar purposes without prosecution. It pointed out that the trial had been unusually brief, that evidence of selective prosecution had been excluded, that the sentence was disproportionate to the offense. More significantly, the petition argued that Sarah's real crime had been teaching women to defend themselves against assault, a service that should be recognized as public good rather than criminal conspiracy. This language was bold, possibly dangerous for the signatories, yet 127 women had been willing to attach their names to it. The governor, a political appointee named William Seward, no relation to the senator, dismissed the petition without comment. But its existence mattered. It demonstrated that Sarah's influence extended beyond the communities of enslaved and formerly enslaved people, that her message had reached women who had everything to lose by associating themselves with her cause. Several signatories were wives of military officers stationed at forts across Kansas and Oklahoma territories. Others were teachers, shopkeepers, farmers' wives, respectable women who'd taken considerable social risk by signing. News of the petition reached Fort Leavenworth through informal channels. Mrs. Hale, the matron, mentioned it. During a laundry inspection, her tone carefully neutral. Seems you've got friends making noise on your behalf. Won't do any good, but it's something. Sarah absorbed the information without visible reaction. But that night, lying on her narrow platform, she allowed herself a moment of something approaching hope. Not hope for early release. She was too realistic for that, but hoped that her work would outlast her confinement, that the seed she'd planted would continue bearing fruit. The petition had one unintended consequence. It increased scrutiny on Sarah within the prison. The commandant, Colonel Marcus Hayes, became concerned that she might be organizing inmates or using her correspondence to coordinate resistance activities. He ordered all her letters read more carefully, all her interactions observed more closely. Mrs. Hale was instructed to report any suspicious behavior, any attempts to form alliances or share information, but Sarah had anticipated this too. She'd been careful from the beginning to maintain friendly but superficial relationships with other inmates. She offered advice when asked, but never initiated political discussions. Her letters home were carefully crafted to contain nothing. Actionable expressions of gratitude for support, reflections on prison routine, questions about friends' health and welfare. If the authorities were looking for evidence of conspiracy, they found nothing. August brought a heat wave that turned the women's section into something approaching torture. The limestone walls, which held cold so effectively in winter, now held heat with equal efficiency. Women collapsed at the laundry tubs, the straw. Mattresses became breeding grounds for insects that seemed to thrive in the oppressive conditions. Mrs. Hale requested permission to adjust the work schedule, allowing inmates to work during cooler morning hours, but Colonel Hayes denied the request. Rules were rules. Maintaining discipline required consistency. 3 women died that August, 1 from heat stroke, 2 from dysentery that spread through the confined quarters with terrifying speed. The deaths were recorded matter-of-factly. In prison logs, names, dates, causes. The bodies were buried in the prison cemetery with minimal ceremony. Life continued with mechanical indifference. Sarah survived the heat through the same strategies that had gotten her through previous hardships. Methodical hydration, careful rationing of energy, mental discipline that allowed her to separate her consciousness from immediate physical discomfort. She'd learned these techniques in cotton fields under Alabama sun, refined them during the journey to Oklahoma territory, applied them now in this new context. Pain was inevitable. Suffering was a choice in how you process that pain. By September, when temperatures finally began to moderate, Sarah had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her hands, already damaged by laundry work, had developed sores that wouldn't heal properly in the damp conditions. She developed a cough. Nothing serious initially, just a persistent irritation that made sleep difficult. Mrs. Hale noticed, but didn't report it. Minor ailments were common and generally resolved themselves. Drawing attention to every cough or ache would create paperwork nobody wanted. In October, the cough worsened. Sarah began running occasional fevers. Nothing dramatic but persistent. She continued working. Stopping would mean losing privileges, possibly facing punishment for malingering. But her efficiency declined. Tasks that had taken an hour now took 90 minutes. Other inmates noticed and quietly adjusted their own work to compensate, maintaining the expected output so guards wouldn't ask questions. By early November, Sarah could no longer hide the severity of her condition. The cough had become constant, wrecking spasms that left her gasping. The fever spiked higher, sometimes leaving her confused and disoriented. Mrs. Hale finally reported to the prison doctor, a man named Albert Richardson, who visited the women's section once weekly to address medical issues. Dr. Richardson examined Sarah on November 8th. His diagnosis was swift and certain. Pneumonia likely contracted from the combination of dampness, exhausted immune system, and the perpetual chest irritation caused by laundry chemicals. He prescribed bed, rest, better nutrition, and transfer to the infirmary, a separate building with better ventilation and heating. Colonel Hayes approved the infirmary transfer, but denied the request for improved rations. Budget constraints, he explained. The prison operated on fixed appropriations. Special meals for sick inmates would create precedent that couldn't be sustained. Richardson argued that, without adequate nutrition, Sarah's chances of recovery were minimal. Hayes shrugged. She was a federal prisoner serving time for crimes against public order. The government's obligation was to confine her safely, not to ensure her comfort or recovery. The infirmary held 6 beds in a single room, currently occupied by 4 other patients. 2 women with tuberculosis, 1 recovering from a fall that had fractured her collarbone, 1 suffering from some unnamed wasting disease that had reduced her to skeletal fragility. Sarah was assigned a bed near the window, a mixed blessing. The ventilation helped with breathing, but the drafts aggravated her fever. For 3 weeks, she existed in that peculiar state between life and death that serious illness creates. Some days she seemed to improve, sitting up to drink broth, managing brief conversations with other patients. Other days she couldn't distinguish between waking and sleep, her consciousness drifting through memories and dreams without clear boundaries. She dreamed of Alabama, of her mother whose name she'd never known, of 2 brothers sold away before she was old enough to remember their faces clearly. She dreamed of cotton, fields and the scar on her face, and the moment she decided that survival required becoming dangerous. She dreamed of courtrooms and judges and juries who'd looked at her with expressions she still couldn't quite interpret. Horror, yes, but also something else. Respect, fear, recognition. She dreamed of the women she'd taught, the letters she'd collected, the archive she'd built. In her dreams, the archive had physical form, a building made of paper and ink, walls constructed from documented resistance, roof thatched with the stories of women who'd refused to accept the premise of their own powerlessness. People walked through this building, reading the walls, learning from the accumulated knowledge. The building stood solid and permanent, impervious to fire or flood or deliberate destruction. The prison chaplain, Reverend Blackwell, visited the infirmary every few days. He sat beside Sarah's bed and spoke to her about repentance, about accepting divine will, about the peace that came from surrendering pride and acknowledging sin. Sarah listened when consciousness permitted and ignored him when it didn't. On his final visit in late November, she was lucid enough to respond. "Have you ever considered," she asked him, her voice barely above a whisper, "that maybe some things we call sins are actually refusals to participate in greater sins? That defending yourself isn't the same as attacking someone?" Blackwell considered this question with unexpected seriousness. "The Bible is clear about submission to authority," he said, finally, about turning the other cheek, about rendering unto Caesar. These principles exist for reasons. They exist, Sarah replied, because they're convenient for people in power. But they weren't written by women in cabins waiting for Tuesday night visits. They weren't written by people who had to choose between violence and violation. Blackwell had no response to that. He sat in silence for several minutes, then offered a brief prayer and left. He never visited her again. Dr. Richardson checked on her daily, monitoring her deteriorating condition with professional detachment that occasionally cracked to reveal genuine frustration. He knew she was dying. He knew it was preventable. Better nutrition, warmer quarters, earlier intervention. Any of these might have changed the trajectory, but the system didn't allow for such flexibility, so he documented her decline in clinical terms, noted the progression of symptoms, and waited for the inevitable outcome. On December 1st, Sarah experienced a period of unexpected lucidity. The fever had broken temporarily, leaving her weak but clear-headed. She asked Mrs. Hale for paper and pen, saying she wanted to write final letters. Hale hesitated. Dying inmates didn't usually get such privileges, but something about Sarah's calm request made her agree. Sarah wrote 3 letters that afternoon, working slowly, stopping frequently to rest. The first was to her friends in Fort Gibson, thanking them for their support and urging them to continue the work she'd started. The second was to Elizabeth and her other successors, providing final instructions for maintaining the archive and expanding the network. The third was addressed to Judge Breenage's daughter in Philadelphia. Breenage himself had died, but Sarah had learned his daughter had become involved in abolitionist work. In this final letter, Sarah wrote, "Your father understood something that many men in his position refused to see. That law without justice is simply organized violence. He allowed me to defend myself legally because he recognized that the system he served was morally indefensible. I hope you'll continue his work, questioning the premises that others take for granted, insisting that laws serve humanity rather than property. Tell your children that there was once a judge in Oklahoma Territory who chose conscience over convention. In a better world, that wouldn't be noteworthy. In this world, it's worth remembering." She sealed the letters and gave them to Mrs. Hale, who promised to mail them. Whether Hale actually did so remains unclear. No delivery records survived, but years later, copies of all 3 letters appeared in historical archives, suggesting they'd reached their intended recipients and been preserved. On December the 2nd, Sarah's fever returned with renewed intensity. She drifted in and out of consciousness. Her breathing labored and irregular. Dr. Richardson increased her laudanum dosage, prioritizing comfort over lucidity. There was nothing else he could do. Sarah Granger died just after dawn on December 3, 1858, at age 34. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia complicated by general physical decline. 2 other inmates were present, the woman with tuberculosis and Mrs. Hale, who'd stayed through the night despite not being officially on duty. They later reported that Sarah's final words, spoken so quietly they almost missed them, were, "The work continues." She was buried in the prison cemetery that afternoon, in an unmarked grave alongside other inmates who died in federal custody. The spot was marked only by a wooden stake with a number painted on it, 1858 to 117, indicating she was the 17th prisoner to die that year. No family attended. Her mother and brothers had been scattered by sales years ago, their locations unknown. Reverend Blackwell read a brief service, the same generic words he used for all prisoner burials, noting in his journal that Sarah had died without repentance for her crimes, but also without bitterness. Mrs. Hale, standing at the edge of the small gathering of guards and inmates required to attend, later wrote in a letter to her sister, "I've seen many women pass through here, and most leave broken in one way or another. Sarah Granger was different. She remained herself until the end. I don't know if that makes her story tragic or triumphant. Perhaps it's both." News of Sarah's death reached Oklahoma Territory 2 weeks later, carried by a military courier who delivered mail to Fort Gibson. The notice appeared in the territorial newspaper as a brief entry in the deaths column. Sarah Granger, convicted of mail fraud, deceased at Fort Leavenworth December 3rd, no services planned. The brevity was deliberate, minimizing attention, treating her death as an administrative detail rather than an event of significance. But within certain communities, the news traveled differently. It moved through churches and private homes, carried by word of mouth and copied letters, reaching people who'd known Sarah personally or known of her work. The reactions varied widely, reflecting the complex legacy she'd created. Among plantation owners and territorial authorities, There was quiet relief mixed with lingering unease. The Territorial Property Protection Committee issued no formal statement, but several members expressed satisfaction in private correspondence. Cornelius Vance, the Richmond lawyer, who'd finally secured a conviction, wrote to a colleague, "The Granger problem has resolved itself through natural causes. Perhaps now we can return to more settled conditions," but even Vance's letter contained a note of uncertainty, "though I wonder if the damage she caused will prove more lasting than we anticipate." He was right to wonder. Among the communities Sarah had served and influenced, her death sparked something unexpected. Not despair, but renewed determination. The archive she'd built became in her absence more valuable and more carefully protected. Her 3 trained successors intensified their documentation efforts, seeing themselves as custodians of a legacy that demanded continuation. Elizabeth, whose full name history never recorded, wrote in her journal 3 days after learning of Sarah's death. She taught us that knowledge is the only power we truly possess. They could imprison her body, silence her voice, but they could not erase what she documented. That work continues, must continue until the need for such knowledge no longer exists. We owe her this to be as meticulous, as strategic, as unflinching as she was in building something that outlasts any single person. The network Sarah had established proved remarkably resilient. In the 18 months following her death, the documentation system she'd created actually expanded, incorporating new correspondence from Missouri, Arkansas, and as far east as Tennessee. Women who'd never met Sarah, but had learned of her work through secondhand accounts, began sending their own stories, their own observations about patterns of assault and resistance, contributing to an archive that grew more comprehensive, even as its founder lay in an unmarked grave. This expansion wasn't without risks. In April 1859, authorities in Arkansas intercepted a packet of letters being transported between Fort Smith and a church in Little Rock. The letters contained detailed accounts of assaults by plantation owners and documentation of legal proceedings that had followed. 5 women were arrested on charges of conspiracy and seditious correspondence. Their trial attracted significant attention, with prosecutors explicitly linking their actions to Sarah's earlier work, but the trial also backfired in ways prosecutors hadn't anticipated. Defense attorneys used the opportunity to enter the full contents of the intercepted letters into the court record, making public the patterns of assault and inadequate legal protection that Sarah had documented. Newspapers, covering the trial for its sensational elements, found themselves publishing accounts that raised uncomfortable questions about the system itself. The 5 women were convicted. The evidence was too clear to allow acquittal, but received surprisingly light sentences. 6 months in county jail rather than federal prison, with time counted from their arrest date. The judge, in his sentencing statement, noted that while conspiracy charges were technically appropriate, the circumstances giving rise to these actions deserve consideration from lawmakers who might address the underlying conditions rather than merely punishing those who document them. It wasn't reform, but it was acknowledgement. Sarah's work had forced certain conversations into public space, where they couldn't be completely suppressed. The archives Sarah built outlasted her by decades. Her documents, scattered across multiple territories in the late 1850s, were gradually consolidated in the 1870s and 1880s as formerly enslaved people gained the ability to preserve their own histories. Some materials ended up in church basement in Fort Gibson and Tahlequah, carefully wrapped in oilcloth and stored in wooden trunks. Others were incorporated into early African American historical societies forming in larger cities. A significant portion was transferred to Creek Nation archives, where tribal historians recognize their value as documentation of a period when their territory had been torn between competing legal and moral frameworks. One of the more remarkable preservation stories involved a Presbyterian minister named Harold Thompson who'd served in Fort Gibson during the 1850s. Thompson had been ambivalent about slavery, not an abolitionist, but troubled by what he witnessed. After the Civil War, while sorting through church records, he discovered that his predecessor had been storing a collection of Sarah's correspondence in a hidden compartment beneath the pulpit. Rather than destroying these documents, Thompson carefully cataloged them, added contextual notes about the historical period, and eventually donated them to a seminary library in Ohio. His accompanying letter, dated 1877, explained, "These documents made me profoundly uncomfortable when I first discovered them. They describe a world I witnessed but preferred not to acknowledge. Acts of resistance I knew occurred but chose to ignore. I am preserving them not because they reflect well on my generation, but because future generations deserve to know what really happened, not the sanitized version we tell ourselves to maintain comfortable consciences." The legal legacy of Sarah's trials proved equally complex and enduring. While none of her acquits established formal precedent, the cases were too specific, too dependent on local circumstances. They did influence how territorial courts approached similar cases in the years that followed. Between 1859 and 1865, at least 11 cases involving enslaved persons charged with assaulting their masters included references to territorial precedent regarding self-defense under duress. Though never citing Sarah Granger by name, judges seemed to recognize that her trials had created an informal standard that couldn't be completely ignored. Defense attorneys learned to invoke the principles her cases had established without directly mentioning the controversial figure behind them. This indirect influence meant that Sarah's impact on jurisprudence was real but difficult to trace in official records. Her name appeared rarely, but the legal reasoning her trials had generated continued shaping outcomes. More significant than legal precedent was the cultural impact. The women Sarah trained continued her work documenting assaults and legal outcomes, teaching anatomy and self-defense, building networks of communication that would prove crucial during the chaos of the Civil War and its aftermath. When federal troops occupied Oklahoma Territory in 1863, they found communities of formerly enslaved people who were remarkably well organized, who had preserved records of property ownership and family relationships, who understood legal procedures with unusual sophistication. Major Benjamin Harris, a Union officer assigned to administer contraband camps near Fort Gibson, wrote in his official report, "The Negro population here displays an unexpected level of organization and legal knowledge. They maintain extensive documentation of their circumstances and possess clear understanding of their rights under military occupation. This preparation suggests long-standing systems of education and communication that preceded our arrival." He didn't know he was observing the fruits of Sarah Greer's decade-old initiative. The networks and practices she'd established continuing to function years after her death. But some of the people he encountered knew. They remembered, even if they couldn't explain to Union officers the full history of how their communities had learned to document and organize. The three men Sarah injured, Wickham, Sheffield, and Drummond, lived out their lives in varying degrees of obscurity. Their connection to her story, something they never acknowledged publicly. James Wickham sold his Oklahoma plantation in 1860 for a fraction of its value and moved to New Orleans, where he invested in cotton trading. He never remarried, never fathered children, lived alone in a boarding house until his death from yellow fever in 1873. His estate inventory revealed a man of modest means, who'd never recovered the wealth he'd possessed before that November night in 1842. A single notation in his personal effects caused confusion among those settling his estate. A newspaper clipping about Sarah's trials, carefully preserved in a leather wallet. Why he kept it, no one could say. Marcus Sheffield remained in Oklahoma Territory, eventually serving 2 terms in the territorial legislature during the 1860s. He became known as a moderate voice on Reconstruction issues, advocating for gradual integration, policies that satisfied neither former enslavers nor freedmen. In 1869, he gave a speech to the legislature about reconciling the territory's past with its future, a carefully worded address that acknowledged historical injustices without directly confronting his own role in them. One passage stood out: "We built a system that demanded certain people bear unbearable burdens, then expressed shock when they refused. Understanding this may help us build something better." He never mentioned Sarah Granger in that speech or any other public statement, But those who knew the history recognized the indirect acknowledgement. Sheffield died in 1881, having outlived Sarah by 23 years. Elias Drummond, who'd freed Sarah and paid her to leave after the third incident, had the most interesting trajectory. He became a vocal advocate for emancipation in the early 1860s, joined the Republican Party when it organized in Oklahoma Territory, and served as a delegate to several Reconstruction conventions. His advocacy earned him the resentment of former colleagues and threats from groups opposed to racial equality. In 1867, during a contentious town meeting in Fort Gibson, someone finally confronted him about his history with Sarah Granger. Drummond's response was recorded by a newspaper reporter. "I made the same mistake as others, believing that legal ownership somehow justified moral transgression. I was corrected in a manner I could not ignore or misinterpret. That correction changed how I understood the world. If my current advocacy surprises you, perhaps you should consider what your own correction might look like. Whether this represented genuine moral evolution or simply a pragmatic recognition of changing political circumstances remains debatable." But Drummond's late life advocacy did achieve some concrete results, including support for African American educational institutions and legal aid societies in Oklahoma Territory. He died in 1889, having contributed significantly to institutions that would have been impossible under the system he'd once participated in. The cemetery at Fort Leavenworth, where Sarah was buried, underwent several expansions and reorganizations over the decades. By the 1920s, the section holding federal prisoners had been largely cleared. The graves relocated to make room for military personnel. Sarah's remains, along with those of dozens of other inmates, were moved to an unmarked mass grave on the prison's eastern boundary. A small stone marker erected in 1934 by a women's historical society notes that the area contains federal prisoners, 185182, but makes no mention of specific names. The marker's inscription reads simply, "Here rest those whose lives ended in federal custody. May their stories not be forgotten." It's a generic memorial applicable to everyone and specific to no one, precisely the kind of erasure that Sarah had worked against throughout her life. In 1891, 33 years after Sarah's death, a researcher named Margaret Hutchinson discovered a trunk of her letters in a Presbyterian church in Tequa. Hutchinson was writing a comprehensive history of Oklahoma Territory for a national publication and had been interviewing elderly residents about their memories of the pre-Civil War period. Several women mentioned Sarah Granger, describing her in terms that initially made Hutchinson skeptical. The story seemed too dramatic, too perfectly aligned with abolitionist mythology to be entirely factual. But the letters and journals proved the story's essential accuracy. Hutchinson spent 6 months authenticating the documents, cross-referencing them with court records, newspaper accounts, and military records from Fort Leavenworth. What she found was remarkable. Sarah's documentation had been meticulously accurate. Dates matched, names corresponded to census records. Legal proceedings aligned with court archives. The woman had been, among other things, a careful historian. Hutchinson published her findings in a lengthy 1893 article titled "A Peculiar Case of Resistance: The Life and Legal Trials of Sarah Granger." The article appeared in a respected historical journal and caused a minor sensation in academic circles. Hutchinson's analysis was careful and measured, avoiding both hagiography and condemnation, instead presenting Sarah as a complex figure whose actions raised uncomfortable questions about law, morality, and resistance. The article was largely ignored by mainstream historians, who were at that time constructing narratives of the antebellum period that downplayed both the violence of slavery and the extent of resistance to it. The lost cause mythology was gaining strength, and stories like Sarah's didn't fit the preferred framework of benevolent masters and contented workers disrupted only by outside agitators. But in other circles, particularly among African American historians and women's rights activists, Hutchinson's article became influential. It was reprinted in several reform publications, excerpted in speeches cited in emerging scholarship about resistance and agency under slavery. Sarah Granger's name began appearing in histories where it had previously been absent. The article was largely ignored by mainstream historians who were at that time constructing narratives of the antebellum period that downplayed both the violence of slavery and the extent of resistance to it. The lost cause mythology was gaining strength, and stories like Sarah's didn't fit the preferred framework of benevolent masters and contented workers, disrupted only by outside agitators. But in other circles, particularly among African American historians and women's rights activists, Hutchinson's article became influential. It was reprinted in several reform publications, excerpted in speeches, cited in emerging scholarship about resistance and agency under slavery. Sarah Greer's name began appearing in histories where it had previously been absent, though her story remained controversial, divisive, uncomfortable. By the early 1900s, Sarah's archive had been largely dispersed again. Some materials were lost in fires that destroyed churches and community centers. Others were deliberately hidden when political winds shifted and documentation of resistance became dangerous to possess. A few collections survived in private hands, passed down through families who understood their value, even if they couldn't safely make them public. The Oklahoma Territory that Sarah had known transformed beyond recognition. Statehood came in 1907, bringing new laws and new tensions. The communities she'd served evolved, adapted, sometimes thrived, and sometimes struggled under changing circumstances. But certain practices she'd established, the emphasis on documentation, the networks of communication, the understanding that knowledge preservation was itself an act of resistance, these endured in modified forms. The women whose names appeared in Sarah's correspondence mostly died, without their stories being recorded beyond what she documented. They lived, resisted when possible, survived when resistance wasn't possible, and eventually passed from living memory into the fragmented historical record. Their individual stories were lost, but the patterns Sarah had identified and documented remained visible to those who knew where to look. The three men Sarah, Injured, Wickham, Sheffield, and Drummond, took their full stories to their graves. Whatever guilt, resentment, or understanding they developed about that period of their lives remained private, shared only in ways that left no permanent record. Their descendants, if they knew the family history, chose not to preserve it. Some silences are deliberate. The legal principles Sarah's trials had established, such as they were, proved fragile. Subsequent courts sometimes referenced the precedents, sometimes ignored them entirely, depending on political climate and judicial temperament. The questions her cases had forced into public discourse about property rights versus human rights, about self-defense under oppression, about the moral limits of legal authority. These questions didn't disappear, but neither were they resolved. They simply continued unanswered and unanswerable within the frameworks that had generated them. What Sarah Granger understood and what made her dangerous to the system she challenged was something deceptively simple. That resistance required documentation to be effective. Acts of defiance meant little if they weren't recorded, analyzed, shared with others who might learn from them. She transformed individual moments of self-defense into a documented pattern, personal tragedies into evidence of systematic abuse, isolated incidents into proof of widespread practice. This transformation from individual experience to collective knowledge represented a threat more profound than any single act of violence. A woman who defended herself was a problem. A woman who taught others to defend themselves was a crisis. But a woman who documented the patterns, preserved the evidence, and built systems for sharing that knowledge across time and distance, that was revolutionary. The system responded the only way it knew how, through legal mechanisms designed to silence without martyring, to punish without creating symbols, to eliminate the threat while maintaining the appearance of justice. They convicted her on technical charges, imprisoned her far from her network, and waited for disease to accomplish what courts hadn't been able to achieve through execution. But Sarah had anticipated even this. The archive existed independent of her. The knowledge had been shared too widely to be completely suppressed. The practices she'd established had become habits for enough people that they continued automatically, requiring no central coordination. She'd built something that could function without her, and it did. In the end, Sarah Granger's story is about the stubborn persistence of knowledge, the way information refuses to stay buried when enough people value its preservation. It's about the courage required not just to resist, but to document that resistance, knowing that documentation itself could be used as evidence against you. It's about the complex relationship between violence and self-defense, between legal structures and moral imperatives, between individual survival and collective action. The questions her life and death raised about justice, resistance, and the price of dignity remained unresolved when she died in 1858, and remained unresolved for generations after. Perhaps some questions aren't meant to be resolved, only to be asked, repeatedly, each generation answering for itself within the circumstances it faces. Sarah Granger died in an unmarked grave at age 34, her body disposed of, with bureaucratic efficiency, her name deliberately excluded from memorials. But the work she'd done, the knowledge she'd preserved, the networks she'd built, these survived her by decades, transformed and adapted to new circumstances, but recognizable to anyone who understood what they were looking at. History is filled with people who fought battles we benefit from without having fought ourselves. Some we remember with monuments and holidays. Others leave barely a trace in official records known only through scattered documents and second-hand accounts. Sarah Granger fell into this second category. Too controversial to celebrate, too significant to completely erase, existing in that uncomfortable space where history acknowledges events without quite knowing how to judge them. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Sarah Granger's actions were justified given her circumstances? How should we understand resistance that uses violence in self-defense? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this historical mystery, this exploration of a life that challenged the legal and moral foundations of its time, subscribe to Circle of Fear 1, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates complex, difficult histories. The past is never as simple as we'd like it to be, and sometimes the most important stories are the ones that refuse easy moral conclusions. See you in the next video. Until then, stay connected with Circle of Fear 1.